My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report, and our special guest for the hour, Sal Mercogliano, who's going to be talking about all things supply chain. And Sal, I'm glad we connected here because you're a real thought leader and expert in a part of the world which is increasingly getting more and more attention and which may be largely understood because people just throw out these terms like supply chain disruptions and don't quite understand sort of the mechanism with which things flow. So we'll get into a lot of conversation here. Before we do, though, Sal, introduce yourself to the audience as far as your background, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. My name is Sal Mercogliano. I'm an associate professor of history over at Campbell University in North Carolina. I'm a former merchant mariner. I sailed for 7 years, worked both afloat and ashore. Came ashore, got my master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology, a PhD in military and naval history. But I've also worked since 2008 for the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, where I teach a graduate level course in maritime industry policy. I'm a contributor to G-Captain and Freight Waves on all things related to global shipping.
And you've got a great YouTube channel. I just caught this morning what's going on with shipping, which is we'll be talking a lot about that. Okay, so
yeah, I'm terrible at plugging myself, Michael. You're right. I do have that YouTube channel. What's going on with shipping? I appreciate that.
No, and you're killing it. I mean, you got nearly 50,000 subscribers. I'm trying to build up my own YouTube channel, and it's a grind. I mean, it's unbelievably how difficult to get those subscribers on YouTube. And I think you've got a really good focus area, which we'll get into. Okay, so I just did a space with Liz Young of SoFi, and I asked her the question, how much of inflation today, in her opinion, was driven by the sheer amount of dollars printed by the Federal Reserve since COVID versus supply chain disruptions and what's going on with these bottlenecks when it comes to shipping. She was of the opinion that it's much more driven by the consumer than by the supply side. I want you to talk through what is happening today with shipping and why is it that even though we're 2 years from the severity of COVID, this is still a problem?
Sure. So, I mean, you got to go back, Michael, to obviously the outbreak of COVID and the shift in consumption by everybody. If you go back to early 2020, you're talking about trans-Pacific freight rates of anywhere between $1,500 to $2,500 for a container coming across. And, I do believe that a lot of the inflation is being factored in by the supply chain. And you can see that manifest itself in just the freight rates coming across. Within a span of less than a few months, those same freight rates went 10 times as high. And that was largely because of many factors. Obviously, the shift in consumption of people, changing over what they were consuming, but at the same time, hedging bets against, well, this is not going to last long. Again, remember back in May of 2020, we all thought this was going to be quick and we'd be out of it. And on the supply chain side, you need to keep that material flowing 90 to 120 days in advance. However, we know that people started ordering differently. They started buying things differently. And so what had been a pretty tight ocean shipping market became even tighter. There was not enough capacity to handle what was normal shipping plus the new COVID shipping on top of that. And when those freight rates increased, that created a domino effect down the entire supply chain in terms of freight rates. You got to think about it again. Ports were at pretty well capacity. There's growth within the ocean shipping market for a few percentages plus or minus. We were seeing nearly double-digit growth. And what that meant was all of a sudden terminals in LA and Long Beach, which are the most famous of the story taking place here, all of a sudden just started to fill up with containers. You couldn't move. And the number of chassis, something we don't tend to think about, but how do you get those containers out of the terminals? Chassis and rail and road were in short supply. Warehouses, distribution centers began to fill up. And now goods that maybe, you have to understand, we were more efficiently moving goods in the 70s and 80s from China to Chicago than we were in 2021. You could book a container out of China in the 1980s and get it to Chicago in less than, 45 to 60 days. But
hold on. Well, why is it? Let's go down because part of what I want to do with these spaces is obviously educate the audience on the history of this. What caused that transition to make it so much more difficult?
It was literally the sheer volume. Containerization makes the movement of goods nearly seamless. Again, we've grown the amount of goods we move across the world's oceans tremendously. 1950, we moved half a billion tons of cargo. In 2021, we moved almost 12 billion tons of cargo. And the way you do that is through containerization, through these boxes, these intermodal containers. And you have to remember, it's a very short period of time ago, the biggest container ships go back to 2006. We're talking about container ships that were maybe 8,000 boxes. Now you're talking about ships. If you look at Everforward that went aground in the Chesapeake, that's a 12,000 box ship. If you go to Ever Given in the Suez in 2021, that was a 20,000 box ship. And we are able to move goods at huge amounts. And understand, building a ship larger, wider, bigger, that's easy. What's hard to build is the infrastructure to handle that. The ports, the roads, the rail, all those elements need to keep up with the size of vessels. And the problem was, while we were dredging ports, while we were putting in new container cranes, we weren't putting in the distribution centers on land to handle the influx of those containers. Remember the image of the ships anchored off LA and Long Beach, almost 100 ships at one point. That was because you couldn't get the containers out of the terminal. You could offload them. You could offload them without a problem. The issue was never offloading the vessels. The problem was getting the containers out of the terminal. And in a way, we've come to this new technological paradigm or shift we're looming on the horizon of how do we move containers more efficiently, and what is the new supply chain system we're going to use. Just in time doesn't work, because just in time is predicated on the idea that what you're going to need 60 to 100 days in advance. COVID blew that up.
Okay, so let's go down this infrastructure talk for a moment, because presumably that's not just a U.S. phenomenon, right? That it's happening in other parts of the world. Which parts of the world have been able to handle this better because they have better infrastructure? I mean, is it really the U.S. just because we're the biggest and the baddest, or talk through that? Because if it is a global phenomenon, it's going to lead to the question of why is it that everyone's in the same boat?
Well, I mean, if you look around the world, obviously Europe has been able to handle it better than the United States. Matter of fact, the biggest ships in the world in terms of container ships, the big 20,000 to 25,000 box ships, don't come to the United States because the U.S. can't handle them. They go to Europe. They're on the Europe to Asia run. That's where you see them operating. And they're more efficient because they have developed ports. They have developed the infrastructure. They've developed the ability to move the containers out of those ports through a variety of means, road, rail, and coastal trade. The United States, because of its geography and other factors, hasn't been able to keep up. I mean, if you look at the port of LA and Long Beach, for example, Long Beach just at the beginning of COVID opened up a new terminal, what was called the LBCT terminal, the Long Beach Container Terminal. It was automated. It can move containers twice as fast as any other terminal in LA and Long Beach. It can stack them, it can rack them, and most importantly, it can get them on trains and trucks faster than any other container terminal. We have been great at dredging and building new terminals, but we've been terrible at data collection, data distribution, and most importantly, the infrastructure necessary to move from the terminal to the distribution and warehouse centers. We just haven't been able to keep up with that. And that's largely because of the way the U.S. is structured. Water in the United States, the ports, the oceans, that's federal. The terminals, the ports, that's state and municipal. And then, of course, you got to deal with rail and road and the separate sites. And in Europe, they don't do it that way. They do it under a national banner. They're able to really create these massive infrastructure plans to build ports like Rotterdam, Felixstowe, Algeciras. You see them develop overseas. What we have right now is, you're jamming 40% of every container that comes in from overseas through downtown LA and Long Beach. And I don't know, if you've ever driven in downtown LA and Long Beach, one of the things that doesn't come to mind is this is a perfect place to be bringing 18-wheeler tractor trailers. No, let me give you a quick little backdrop on that, Dan. So back in 2015, CMA CGM brought in a 15,000 box ship, the Benjamin Franklin, into LA and Long Beach. And this was going to be the biggest ship that came into the United States. And in CMA CGM, French company, has been one of the big ones to bring in ships. The biggest ship that's been in the United States was a sister ship of her, the Marco Polo. Huge, massive ships. But as early as 2015, when that vessel came in, everybody acknowledged, who handles cargo, said this ship is too big, it's too large, it's going to dump way too many containers. When you come into LA and Long Beach, that most ships that come into LA and Long Beach dump off 80 to 100% of their containers. They basically have to go into LA and Long Beach and dump off nearly all of them. The few remaining containers may be dumped off at Oakland or Seattle Tacoma, but the vast majority of ships that come into LA are 100% dumped. And what that means is LA and Long Beach has adjusted the size of vessels coming in. They tend to go for the mid-range vessels, ships from about 5,000 to 10,000 boxes. The 8,000 box ship is really the ideal one we see going into LA and Long Beach. In 2016, the new lane of the Panama Canal opened up. Prior to 2016, the biggest container ship that can go through the Panama Canal was a 4,000, 5,000 box ship. Now you can bring 10 to 12,000 box ships through the Panama Canal, ships like Everforward. If you look at Everforward as the example from Evergreen, that vessel came through the Panama Canal. It's a 12,000 TEU vessel. And again, TEUs are 20-foot equivalents. Most ships carry 40-foot equivalents. So she was carrying probably about 6,000 to 8,000 boxes on board. But she went to 4 different ports. She went to Savannah, to Baltimore, to Norfolk, to New York. And that's a big shift we're seeing right now because of the backlogs at LA and Long Beach post-COVID. A lot of container companies, a lot of shipping companies, ocean carriers, are now favoring those what are called Neo-Panamax, those vessels that can transit the new lane of the Panama Canal, and they can sail directly through that Panama Canal to the East and Gulf Coast. It's a longer voyage. It requires more money to do it. But even though the freight rate may be higher than what you're going to the West Coast, your reliability to offload the vessels, unless you're Everforward, is pretty good. And you can basically make your schedule. And because you're only dumping 20 to 30% of your cargo in each of those ports, you can do that in a single day or so and then make your next port. Yeah, you're about, depending on the size of the vessel and if you're building on existing previous builds and contracts, you're talking about anywhere from a year to 2 to 3 years. You know, where ships are built today are in 3 places: China, Japan, Korea. They build 94% of the world's ships. And if you look at Maersk, for example, who built one of the largest vessels at the time back in 2013, the Triple E's. These were 18,000 box ships. They were the biggest of their time. They built 20 of them in Korea in 2 years.
You know, what's interesting in hearing this is that this, again, kind of seemed to agree with the notion that it's more about the consumer demand side than the supply side, because these disruptions do create added inflationary pressure, and these disruptions, because of the bottleneck of infrastructure, to your point, just makes everything more accelerated in terms of price movement. What was this looking like prior to COVID? Meaning, is this a situation where we were bound to have these bottlenecks because the infrastructure was never really built parallel to the sort of line of consumer spending? Talk through that a little bit.
No, you're a very wise man, Michael. I was about ready to go there because, one of the things that, it's very important to understand is that, first off, when you look at ocean shipping and containers, there are 9 companies in 3 alliances that control 85% of the container spaces afloat. I mean, that's it. I mean, there's other companies out there, but those 9 big companies in those 3 alliances, the 2M, the Ocean Alliance, and the Alliance, they control most of the containers moving around the world. And, from 2020 to 2021, 2021 to 2022, that was the most profitable year those companies ever had. Matter of fact, the profits they made in the first year of COVID were equal to the profits they made in the previous decade. If you go back into the 2010s, companies were basically really just breaking even, sometimes in the black, sometimes in the red. There was actually overcapacity. One of the things that had been going on for the previous decade or so was a lot of competition between the ocean carriers running out businesses, trying to really cutthroat and low rate companies out. We saw that with the collapse of the seventh largest container liner in 2017, Hanjin Marine, was basically run out of business by some of the big carriers. And the other thing that the ocean carriers were doing were building larger ships. They got on this kick starting in 2013 with Maersk and the Triple E's to build these much larger vessels because they're much more efficient. If your ship is longer, wider, and deeper, it carries more container. It's better to have one large ship than two or three smaller ships because of efficiency, because of the economics. The problem is that has to be translated ashore. The facilities have got to exist ashore to service them. And one of the ideal things about container companies are they don't build those facilities. They typically don't always own and operate their own terminals. And so they shift that cost to municipalities and cities. So, for example, when Maersk built their bigger ships, they couldn't get into the port of New York, New Jersey. Well, the state of New Jersey had to raise the Bayonne Bridge. And the state paid over $1 billion to raise that bridge so that they wouldn't lose out to other ports up and down the East Coast. But prior to COVID, the rates were very low because it was very competitive. There was overcapacity. There was basically spaces. Back in 2017, Maersk got hit by a cyber attack. Took them out of service for 3 weeks. They lost $300 million, nearly wiped every server, every computer they had, except for one in Lagos, Nigeria. And they were gone. They were out of service for 3 weeks. But there was enough excess capacity out there on other carriers to take it up. The problem today is there's no excess capacity. Ships that should have been scrapped over the past 2 years are still in service right now and running. And what we're going to see coming up in the future as things slow down in ocean freight, and we just saw the first quarter reports and we heard the CEO of Hauppauge talk about the fact that he thinks we've peaked and we're starting to come down now. But what they're going to start doing, these ocean companies, is bleeding tonnage. They're going to start scrapping tonnage because of fuel and emissions issues. And the amount of tonnage that's out there that would usually translate into lower freight rates is going to wind up being run up on the beach in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Turkey and being scrapped. You're hitting on a topic that is right now at the forefront. The West Coast ports are up for a contract renegotiation. Their contract expires June 30th of this year. When I say the West Coast ports, I mean LA, Long Beach, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma, every last one of them under the ILWU, the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union. Their contract expires June 30th. And the biggest issue right now is automation. If you go to Shanghai, if you go to any of the ports in China, if you go to Rotterdam, what they call the bomb carts, the trucks that move the containers around the terminal are automated. They move seamlessly. And what that does is it allows you to operate 24/7 in the ports. It allows you to maintain an efficiency. If you look at the top 30 container ports in the world, the U.S. has 3 of them: LA, Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Savannah. In the top 10, China has 8 of them. And the reason they're able to do that is because of this efficiency. And one of the biggest problems we see right now in getting the containers out of the terminals and moving the supply chain along is, believe it or not, a lot of it is still paper. There's still issues with literally showing up with paper, with tracking containers. There's not a system that exists in ocean shipping, for example, that allows you, like when you order something from Amazon, to see the visibility of your product moving. And that's the element that they're talking about, not only with automation. You know, when we talk automation, a lot of people think, well, they're going to put workers out of work. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about shifting over where they need the workers, particularly in the data center side, to make it much more efficient. You know, literally, you show up at the Port of LA in Long Beach in a truck. You have an appointment there. You have to present paperwork. And when I say paperwork, I don't mean a computer. I mean a piece of paper. And it's got to be scanned. And then they have to go bury and dig out your container at times. And this is completely inefficient. Whereas if you do this in Shanghai, if you do this in Qingdao, if you do this in Rotterdam, you know, when your truck comes up, you're scanned and your container is literally waiting for you as you approach. And that just makes for more efficiency. And this is the big negotiation term that's going on right now in the West Coast, is how do we shift over to a more automated system to improve the throughput of containers in and out. You'll hear about backlogs in the terminals, not getting empty containers out. This is one of those issues.
Okay, so do a thought experiment with me real quick, Sal, on this. So if it's about bottlenecks on the ports, what resolves this faster? Infrastructure and efficiency at the port level, or what is now the bigger talking point, which is onshoring manufacturing, so you don't have to worry about ports to begin with? Talk through that, because I think that it's an interesting sort of counter argument to the idea that globalization is gone.
Well, a lot of people are going to be talking about, well, I just did a story. I'm working on a video right now talking about Shanghai opening up, and the German Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai talking about the fact that they've got to get, they can't be closed loop in China anymore. The problem you have with that is whether you're closed loop in China or, if we move off of China and we move to Mexico or we move to Honduras or Brazil, the ports are still your entry point coming in. And if you can't clear the issue in the ports, then we have a systematic problem. And that what we saw, for example, is LA and Long Beach left the headlines for a variety of reasons. One of them is they pushed the ships offshore, so you couldn't see them. There's still 40 ships waiting to offload in LA and Long Beach. But the problem is now it's shifted to other ports. It's moved to Charleston, to Savannah, to New York, New Jersey. And we're getting ready to see a bullwhip effect once the ports in China go full force again after their shutdowns. We've got to invest, obviously, in the infrastructure in the ports. And the problem is port infrastructure right now is done, I'm not going to lie, it's done in the most asinine, haphazard way you can imagine. Because, again, the water is controlled by the federal government, but the ports are controlled by state and municipalities. If you look at LA and Long Beach, it's the city of LA and the city of Long Beach that own the property. They operate as landlords, and they lease terminals to these operating companies to operate the terminals. And it is up to basically these corporations, these businesses, and these municipalities to set national policy when it comes to ports. And they're all right now fighting over this new pool of money that just came out of Congress, this $1.2 or $3 billion port infrastructure that's out there to try to improve. And we've got a big debate going on. Should we focus our effort on the four corners strategy? Should we invest in LA, Long Beach, Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, four big regional large ports? Or should we be divesting into smaller ports to allow these vessels to offload smaller portions of their cargo? And unfortunately, that debate is being had by commercial companies and by shippers and carriers. It's not being had by the federal government. This is the big debate. No, I don't, obviously not. But, you got to go back to the idea of what a dock worker is. Again, it's not Marlon Brando on the waterfront. These are guys who are either driving bomb carts through the yard, moving containers, or they're up in the cranes moving. That's what we're starting to talk about. And what the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, who's in negotiations, they run the ports and they represent the ports, the terminals, and everything.
So obviously the thing is that the issue with automation is going to be what style of new worker does the ILWU want, and it's going to be an issue. The big thing is data. I mean, having the open data is going to be the big issue. The Federal Maritime Commission, which is the federal entity that oversees international shipping, is pushing the ocean carriers now to be more visible with their data to improve traffic flow and for us to get a better gauge on the amount of freight moving. And it's just been a problem across the boards. So sorry about that.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that too, it's one of the impetuses now for the smaller developing ports. It's going to be very hard for LA and Long Beach, which again does the focus of a lot of movements, to change. But for new ports like Charleston, for Savannah, for Norfolk, there are opportunities now for them to use these newer systems to be much more efficient. For example, Savannah has been really efficient. This is a port that's been growing tremendously. If you look at the growth of the port of Savannah, it's been absolutely unbelievable. They've dredged, they've gotten themselves down to the 50-foot mark, but more importantly, they have the land, they have the area down there to put in warehouses, distribution centers. They're putting in the technology. They're keenly located on major highways, rail, airport systems. And, this is the potential. When you look at what Europe did with the development of their ports, they didn't build the ports in downtown cities. They went outside. They had areas where they built so that they can do this. And that's what's got to happen. The problem you have, again, is the timing on the West Coast right now for any sort of change is coming up against this union renegotiation. And labor has never been in a stronger position since the 1930s to negotiate a new contract when it comes to the dock workers. And I've been talking to them like crazy, and I keep getting pushback from them. It's like, no, we're not going to have a slowdown. We're not going to do it. It's like, you can say everything you want, but as what's happening right now, because we got a month and a half here of instability till that new contract is supposed to come into place, it's creating doubt. And when you create doubt in freight, you create higher rates. And what we're seeing is more cargo dumping through the Panama Canal, going to the Eastern Gulf Coast. But we just had the ILA, which is the East Coast version of the ILWU, come out in agreement in support of the ILWU. Now, they're a whole different entity. They're not as organized together, and their contracts aren't up. But, what the West Coast does, I couldn't tell you because I don't think they know what they're going to do. Yeah, well, I know it kind of imploded on itself with IBM and Maersk quite a bit. I mean, they were touting it for quite a while. I mean, obviously Maersk had that issue. I mean, it comes back to the cybersecurity issue where they got hit by NotPetya. And now all of a sudden they, with IBM, were developing the platform. And again, it hasn't gone the way that, a good buddy of mine, John Conrad, runs G Captain, and he's more in tune on this story than I am. But what I do know about it is that Maersk was trying across the 2M system, them and Mediterranean Shipping Company, was to get more transparency across the board and still provide a secure network for themselves. And they have just not been able to get it to operate the way they want. And listen, this is the inherent problem of ocean shipping carriers, is that, they operate in these open systems. You have freight forwarders, you have non-vessel owner common carriers, NVOCs. And, now you have ocean carriers who are flush with money. I mean, they have more money now than ever before. And what you saw Maersk do very recently is lock out the freight forwarders. They want to take control of freight carriage on their vessels. This would be like American Airlines shutting out Expedia from booking flights on their plane. That's what they're trying to do. And, I always argue that sailors with money in their pocket are the worst thing in the world. They don't know what to do with it. And that's what the big ocean carriers have right now. They're probably not drunk, but they're close to it. And they're trying to figure out how to spend that money. The other issue that they have looming on the horizon is that every vessel built today and the vessels being built currently are all going to be out of service within 20 years because of fuel issues, because there's a looming issue on the horizon dealing with the International Maritime Organization and the push toward decarbonization. And fuel issues are just the big issue that's just looming for all these guys. Yeah, if you look, again, one of the things I'd recommend you guys look at is the Pacific Maritime Association annual report. This is the entity that basically coordinates with the ILWU, the International Longshoremen and Warehouses Union. So those are the two entities that are negotiating that West Coast right now. And when you look at the labor cost for the dock workers, it's pretty good. They make good money. And this is all part of that renegotiation they're talking about. One of the things that preceded all this is that the ILWU is very careful about the training and education of new dock workers, what they call casuals. And they had a process in place to start training new dock workers to handle the phase out retirement of the older ones, and then the potential increase should there be a need. And one of the problems we saw was a lot of the terminals and a lot of the dock workers, there just wasn't enough of them to handle the influx coming in. And so part of the renegotiation right now is the phase out of, and this is part I know from guys I've talked to that are in these negotiations, is that they're talking about how can we get the older guys to retire out, pay for that, and then train in the new workers. So yeah, this goes to the cost to offload. One of the underreported stories here, when we talk about the backlog at LA and Long Beach, and you had the Biden administration talk about 24/7 operations, is, yeah, we couldn't handle 24/7 operations for a couple of reasons. Couldn't handle it because the warehouses and distribution sites were closed. But more importantly, a lot of the terminals didn't want to pay the extra money to make workers work those overtime hours because it was really cost prohibitive and it was above and beyond their freight rates that they had already factored in. A lot of ocean carriers now in their agreements are putting in elements that allow them to increase the costs of the transportation if rates all of a sudden begin to spike up. One of the things that the ocean carriers pushed during COVID were long-term rates that you could lock in for a year or two. And so you can get out of the spot rate market, the last minute charter rates, because the spot rate markets were going through the roof. Now what we're seeing is the spot rates are starting to become equal to long-term rates, if not dip down below. And again, the contract renegotiation is going to be a lot of a factor in this.
By the way, I think this is such a fun conversation. I'm getting a lot of people DMing, and somebody's DMing right now saying, "Stop the bullshit! Call the National Guard." on this, which I'm sure there's a lot of validity which we could talk about. But let's go to an implementation question from an investment perspective, and also and maybe add is that sort of and maybe that's also a question for you, Sal, because I'm sure I assume you probably look at this too. How does one play this from an investment standpoint, and is it better to do individual positions or to bet on a particular theme? And if it's a theme which you can access via the ETF, what would that theme be, right? So maybe kind of go with that direction.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are certain elements for investing purposes to look at. A lot of believe it or not, a lot of the big ocean carriers that, you talk about the big nine, not all of them are really investable. I mean, they're family-owned businesses, some of them, so they're not even open for trading. That's why you've seen such a big interest in companies like Zim, for example, which isn't one of the big ones, but it had its IPO right during the beginning of this. And so it garnered a lot of traction. If you follow guys like Greg Miller over at Freightways, he does a great job in really highlighting on some of the key stocks and freights areas. But, one of the big things is the container leases and the chassis manufacturers. Those have been really interesting to watch how they move up and down at this time. Triton, which is a huge container lessee. It used to be back in, go back in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s, the container company, the big container lines, Maersk, for example, owned its containers. That's why you see all those names on those containers all the time. They own the chassis. That's not the case anymore. When everything went bad in the early 2000s, they divested themselves of that. So you've got these lessee companies that are out there now. You've got these terminal operators that are out there now. One of the things we saw is some of the container companies are buying back terminals so that they can have fixed terminals ashore. So there's a lot. Again, I look at the macro of the industry. I'm not really that much into talking about that, but Greg Miller over at Freightways is one of the big guys I follow, along with a few others. No, you're exactly right. And that fall off point was 2008, obviously the recession. I mean, you go back and you look at the long term, everything was good back then. And then, it's really reflective, obviously, in the container companies, particularly with the world market. But, some of them are. And I agree with you. Matson is one of those yielders right now. It's a smaller company, U.S. firm. It's in the closed Jones Act trade. This is the coastal trade between the United States, particularly U.S. and Hawaii, West Coast. It has been doing extremely well in that area. A lot of the other bigger firms are, the problem is most of these companies are offshore companies. So, when you talk about Mediterranean shipping, when you talk about Hapag Lloyd, when you talk about CMA, CGM and Evergreen and HMM, they're all overseas. So, again, a little bit difficult to do it. But right now, again, one of the things we're seeing, and I just listened to Hapag's first quarter report, Maersk first quarter report, and all of them are the same thing. Massive first quarter results, equal or if not better than what they were doing in 2021. But they're all talking about that they may have peaked, but they're at levels now they haven't been in since prior to 2008. And the question is, do they come down back to pre-COVID levels or do they stay high? And I am of the opinion they stay high for a variety of reasons. Number one, there's been consolidation. There's been the 9 firms that control 85% of the stock. If you go back just 10, 15 years, it was 10 companies controlled 50% of ocean shipping. So you've got this massive consolidation. they have now figured out how to make this work a lot better than they did. They're in these alliances that are basically cartel-like, but they're not, although that has gotten the attention of the Department of Justice now. And we're seeing the Department of Justice and the Federal Maritime Commission doing some investigations on that level. They just recently subpoenaed Maersk for some information about it. But both the EU and the US has allowed this, along with China, has allowed these alliances to exist. So again, that's my perspective. Again, I come at it from a little bit of a different, I'm not quite the financial guy as some of the other guys on this call. Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing right now is availability of containers have increased. Now, I should mention that there's a bit of a flip side with that, with the slowdown coming out of China right now. What we're seeing right now is Europe just reported a shortage in containers because they're not getting the boxes out of Asia like they were. You know, one of the big things that happened during COVID was a big push by the ocean carriers to get empty containers back to Asia as quick as they can. They make money on the west to east route. They don't make money on the east to west route. So, you know, so if they're coming out of the west coast of the United States, pre-COVID, we were moving about 2 empty containers for every full container. By mid-COVID, we were moving 3 empty containers for every full container. And what was happening was the ocean carriers were prioritizing empty containers over full. And those were those stories you were seeing from the exporters, particularly the agricultural exporters, not able to get their goods out. And I think the estimate was about 31% of ag exports on the West Coast were not able to get out because of the lack of either getting a bulk ship or getting onto a container vessel. That's one of the things that's prompting the Congress to pass the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. There's 2 separate bills, one out of the House, one out of the Senate. They both passed, but they're not the same bill, so they got to go through a reconciliation. And one of the things that they're pushing is to make the ocean carriers prioritize American exports. I don't know how legally they do that. It's a foreign companies, how you prioritize it without holding them out of U.S. ports. And so that's a big issue. It's coming on. The World Shipping Council, which is their legislative body for the ocean carriers, is lobbying very hard against the Ocean Shipping Reform Act and these provisions.
Let me rephrase it because it was a little bit hard to hear because I saw it from the DM. So basically the question is, if the U.S. is able to somehow ramp up production, kind of similar to that prior question about the thought experiment, production versus infrastructure, how quickly could ramped up production maybe ease some of these bottlenecks on the port side?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the issue you have with that is a couple of factors there. Number one, I mean, one of the things we're seeing right now in China, for example, with their lockdowns and shutdowns is, yeah, we're not seeing goods coming out, but more importantly, China imports more than they actually export in certain areas. And one of the things we're going to see is a lot of technology is being imported into China for part of the fabrication and manufacturing of finished goods. You have to talk about 100% manufacturing of all components domestically to avoid the port issues. And what we saw, for example, with car manufacturing in the United States is once you didn't get those chips in, cars were just lined up and parked until we can get them in. So unless you can get 100% manufacturing in the US, you are still going to be dependent for port offsets and port delays. It doesn't take much to really create these problems. What's unique about COVID is it happened 100% around the world at the same time. But we've seen regional disruptions from hurricanes and storms and everything. So that, you know, can you really onshore all elements of your production? Because if not, we've seen areas where this happens. Fraser River up in Canada going to the port of Vancouver, you know, had massive floods, shut off the port of Vancouver from the central part of Canada. And that created massive backlogs in and out of that port. And this is one of those elements. It creates log jams going in and out of ports. So I think even if we onshore domestic production, you've got to onshore all elements of it, but that's almost impossible to do these days. Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that you always got to be looking at is being as diversified and as flexible as you can in the delivery and distribution of your goods. You know, a lot of what happened to a lot of people with the beginning of COVID is they were locked into LA and Long Beach. You know, their goods was going out of LA and Long Beach to, the Inland Empire to Ontario, and they couldn't break out of that. They were stuck there. They just could not take advantage of alternatives when they opened up. During the height of LA and Long Beach backlog, the Port of Oakland was wide open, but people weren't taking advantage of it because they couldn't shift their ability to get out of there. One of the things we saw happen during this is some big carriers, Amazon, IKEA.
I apologize. Next time I need to make sure I tell my wife I'm on this thing with you beforehand. So, the big thing is, again, I go back to the issue of innovation in how to move your goods. You got to diversify. You can't be doing the same thing. Again, companies like Amazon, Home Depot, IKEA really found diverse ways to move cargo. Amazon went to the extreme, chartering vessels, self-sustaining container ships that they could load in China, bypass the big ports, and go into ports like Houston and offload. Obviously, that's beyond the capabilities of many carriers and shippers. But one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of innovative freight forwarders and NVOCs are looking to pool together smaller groups so that they can prioritize high value, high priority cargo. And I think we're going to see the big container companies do that. I think you're going to see them invest in smaller vessels that can do that. The basic answer for why LA Long Beach happened, first off, everybody knew it was going to happen. I mean, there was a Federal Maritime Commission report in 2015 that identified all these issues. But basically what happened is the Port of LA and Long Beach opened itself up for any ship in the world to come in. And so when shippers couldn't get their cargo booked on the big ocean carriers, a host of new operators and players got into the market, announced that, hey, we've got an open ship, we can ship it for you, we'll get it to LA and Long Beach. And what happened is literally these ships showed up off LA and Long Beach and started vying for available berths. And basically LA and Long Beach overbooked. They overbooked themselves. It'd be like an airport that can handle 100 planes all of a sudden is handling 300 planes. And the facilities were not in place to do it. And more importantly, because of COVID and shutdowns and lockdowns, they couldn't get the material out of the terminal fast enough. They didn't invest in the technology, the automation we talked about. One terminal did, the LBCT terminal, the others didn't. And what happened was they were just a tsunami wave of containers came at them and they just couldn't get it. And that's the big fear looming on the horizon right now. When China reopens back up, does that happen again? Right. And that's you go back to it in Wilmington, those towns in that area all suffered that throughout that period.
No, this is a phenomenal conversation. Again, I'm going to have this as edited YouTube podcast. And by the way, I will say thank you to all those that were asking questions. It makes my life easier. It's almost like crowdsourcing a podcast, which will be up on YouTube. Sal, you're the man. I really do appreciate this hour and the knowledge you impart. Usually when I do these spaces, it's much more stock market investment specific. But I think stuff like this is really important for people to hear. So thank you for that. And everybody again. So thanks again. Thank you, Sal.